A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Well, tomorrow, Tasmanian listeners are back to the polls. Another state election. Voters will choose the future they want for their children. Staring down the barrel of a hung parliament. If you're thinking it's not long since the last one, yep, just March last year. Jeremy Rockliff is the incumbent Liberal Premier who has led a minority government relying on independents and a Jackie Lambie Network MP. He lost a no-confidence motion by the opposition leader Dean Winter, which passed by just one vote. Jeremy Rockliff called an early election instead of being forced to quit. And it may not deliver a much different result to last time. Well, Ashlyn from the Australian Christian Lobby is joining us. They've got a great resource for voters, tasvotes.org.au, the website. We'll talk about that as we go through our conversation. But a special welcome back to 2020 to you, Ashlyn Weiss.
As always, great pleasure to join, Neil.
You know, Ashlyn, the Premier, Jeremy Rockliff, says he didn't want this early election, and Tasmanians, you know, from all that you hear, didn't want this early election, but it was forced by the leader of the opposition. I guess this is the way politics works, doesn't it?
That's right. Unfortunately, it does. And I think what we're hearing on the ground is that there is a sense of frustration from voters about yet another election. Not only did they have a state election last year, as you mentioned, but they've also had to face a federal election only a few months ago. And so, unfortunately, it is the way politics work, but it may not work in favour of the major parties having, I guess, forced voters to unwillingly have to go to the ballots again.
You know, we'll get on to that, the potential outcomes, which don't always look positive. But Ashlyn, you know, our conversation's about the ACL resource for Tasmanian voters, but you've got connections everywhere. Have you been able to glean any sense of the mood from Tasmanians?
Yeah, well, I do think the sense is a bit of frustration. There's a lot going on in Tasmania. It's possible that the Labor Party, when calling this no confidence motion, were trying to capitalise on a strong federal election result. But what we're hearing, and polls are telling us, is that Labor's only getting around a 24.7 primary vote at the moment. But Liberals are not doing swimmingly well either. And so I think that the mood is a little bit dismissive of the campaigns going on at this point.
You know, what always impresses me with the Australian Christian Lobby and your approach to elections and that tendency not to be one-sided, there's not necessarily preference, but obviously if you're looking through a Christian lens, sometimes there's no choice but actually to say, well, this one's better than that one. You should give some attention to that. Hey, the other thing that happens is, you know, meet the candidate forums, and there was something very special last night, and I know that so many listeners will recognise this as a very powerful thing. There was a prayer webinar that was hosted by the Australian Christian Lobby. Were you able to glean anything from those who participated in that prayer webinar as the sorts of things they were concerned about?
That's right. It was a really special online prayer forum last night. We had prayer leaders from churches all around the state, I think 11 prayer leaders, and we had around 70 to 80 attendees. The sense was to pray about issues that do impact the spread of the gospel in Tasmania, the integrity to truth in policy. So while there's all these economic issues going on, there are concerns around faith-based schooling and the freedom of the gospel. There are concerns around the LGBTQI plus agenda. And I'm not sure if you realise, Neil, but Tasmania is actually the most secular state in Australia, recording 50% of people saying that they're not religious, which is actually a higher a higher number of non-religious people than even the Australian Capital Territory. So you've got a situation where campaigns from people who are in fact against Christianity in public gain a lot of traction. So the prayer last night was really focusing on revival and renewal amongst the church in Tasmania, unity, and just the gospel being able to go forth and touch the hearts of people, and also for the church to be aware of these policy issues and to vote wisely.
You know what? I'll bet, not that I'm a betting man, but I would imagine that listeners in Tasmania, they might be actually quite shocked at the level of secularisation, the manoeuvring that people have had away from saying that they are religious. And I can't help but, when we think about elections, the way people might vote, if they go along those lines and they vote for what will ultimately be chaos without the sort of values that you and I might appreciate, Ashlyn, that is a likely outcome. Maybe some people would say they've already had it very chaotic in Tasmania, and that may be partly around this idea of people not religious, not worried about what morals are being legislated. In other words, like no moral compass, and that is a recipe for chaos. I don't know if you've got any little reflection around that, but you know, sometimes we discount the power of the religious faith vote for actually keeping things stable. Have you got any thoughts?
Oh, look, well, I studied law, Neil, and I can tell you that every law is a reflection of some kind of moral principle. So you can't escape the fact that, I guess, a purpose of the law is to state what is and is not acceptable, and therefore it is a moral statement. If the criticism against laws that are grounded in Christian values is that they are moral, well, any other law that says otherwise is also a moral statement. So it's really about being able to effectively communicate the heart and the purpose behind why we need those Christian values to uphold a stable and a good society. And the benefit that it brings, not just to the Christian community, but to every single person. So we like to say, for example, on the issue of faith-based schooling offers many benefits to people outside of faith communities. But also in general, we believe as Christians, if the truth can be promoted in law, so let's say the importance of freedom of speech around issues like gender, male and female, pushing back against extreme conversion law proposals, then more people are able to access the truth and be liberated by that.
Wonderful insights. You know, what's moral and what's the contrast, what's immoral. And when we talk about things with the Australian Christian Lobby, as we frequently do, and we frequently talk to you, Ashlyn, we're talking about how a foundation in a biblical morality which has stood the test of time, which actually breeds the sort of society that is a livable, functional, wonderful, flourishing society. If you want to dismantle those things, well, you know, your vote might be very important because you might be voting for what is a chaotic, immoral situation. Hey, this may be where the Tasmanian Parliament is headed, another hung parliament. I know that, you know, some will say, well, you know, isn't that good that everybody's got so much complexity? It's harder to make decisions. But what do you think the downsides of a hung parliament might be? I guess we're looking at who's on whatever crossbench.
The downside of a hung parliament is it's going to be very hard to then, either what will happen is because the party hasn't won a majority, that they'll have to, let's say it was the Liberal, that they would have to scramble to find support from the crossbench, which, you know, will then lead them to a minority government, which just makes it hard to push good legislation through. Means that the legislative process is a lot slower. Election promises are harder to fill, all that kind of difficulty.
Okay, now when people go to this website, tasvotes.org.au, And it's become, really, it's part of the landscape now every time there's an election, whether it's a state election or a federal election. You've got a great team of researchers at the Australian Christian Lobby. You know, for people who are supporting, this is the sort of thing that happens. A great resource like this tasvotes.org.au, when people go onto there, they're able to look at not only the parties, but really drilling down to the candidates. Have you got any thoughts here around, you know, what sort of solid members might be standing for election tomorrow? What are your perceptions and what's on the website?
So listeners in Tasmania may want to get their pens out or take some notes, but we do have solid policy information on our website. But I thought I'd just share, Neil, a couple of names of solid Christian candidates that we do know are Christian and have committed to uphold these values in the Tasman. So there's 5 electorates in Tassie. In the electorate of Bass, there's Michael Ferguson, Julie Sladden, Sarah Quayle and George Rose as solid options there. And the electorate of Braddon, Felix Ellis is committed to upholding Christian values. In Lyons, Guy Barnett, the current Attorney General. In Franklin, we have Erica Betts and Jackie Petrusma. And in Clark, finally, you've got Simon Barakis, Jessica Barnett and Marlena Di Florio, all committed Christians that we know of that will uphold these very important policies in our parliament.
All right, there's a bunch of great names there, and, you know, we don't have the wool pulled over our eyes to assume that just because someone says they are a Christian that they are going to actually hold some level of Christian ethics, but some of those names there are well known to listeners, and you'll know that there are some pretty solid Christian foundations in some of those candidates and members that you have just mentioned. Hey, what about the economic issues around things that are happening? We'll get on to some of those really important things that the ACL gets a fabulous focus on. But let's talk about this for a moment. A new stadium. It's a worry for a lot of people. Have you been gleaning any sort of thoughts around the new stadium, the proposal for the AFL stadium at Macquarie Point?
So what I'm told, it really is the draw card issue for this election. Whilst there is a groundswell of support for an AFL team in Tasmania, there's been a lot of controversy around the proposed stadium. Costs for it have blown out to $1 billion. And it's proposed to be built at Macquarie Port, which is right wedged between some heritage buildings, including the Symphony Orchestra, which has given rise to a lot of complaints about noise probably drowning out those beautiful performances. I think because there's been such a push for the stadium, it's bypassed some normal planning processes. But both major parties are supporting the stadium. So I think because of that, voters are looking to independents or even the Greens who are opposing it.
That's really interesting, isn't it? A football stadium, the Liberals and the Labor Party supporting the development. They've got a few little nuances, I think, in the way that they're, you know, Liberals wanting to keep a cap on public debt. But as you say, things have blown out. Labor wanting to support some passage of special enabling legislation, but the Greens opposing the development. So they've taken a position there where they're wanting to take advantage of the mood of Tasmanians around football. Interesting here because we often will talk about the Greens and the diabolical, evil policies of the Greens. To capture an anti-stadium mood in Tasmania may actually have other ramifications. Have you got any thoughts around that?
That's right. Well, it isn't looking as if the Greens are necessarily going to get a minority government or anything extreme like that. Tasmania is interesting. The Labor Party is a little bit stronger on their take in not working with the Greens, and that's for a few historical reasons. So Labor isn't keen on forming any kind of coalition with them. And that has probably some upsides in them we know that the Greens' social policies are quite extreme and very concerning. So we look as much as possible to just highlight that and let the Tasmanian voters realise that, okay, well, perhaps you'll vote for them because you don't want a stadium, but they also want to decriminalise hard drugs and other extreme things such as that.
As I say, when we talk about some Greens policies, when I say those words diabolical and evil, they're not even an exaggeration. I mean, you can find some worse words for Greens policies. Hey, there's lots of things we could talk about. We could talk about housing affordability, cost of living. All of those things are going to be important to Tasmanians. But let's just focus for a few moments on some key issues that the ACL is always hard at work on, things like conversion therapy in Tasmania. We know that conversion therapy legislation criminalises Christians, criminalises parents, criminalises doctors. Thoughts here around where they might be at and how important an issue like that might be for Tasmanian voters?
So this is really important for Tasmanian voters to consider. Tasmania is one of the few states that has not yet introduced a conversion bill, but it is very much on the horizon. The Rockcliffe Liberal government does have a draft piece of legislation, and of course we are concerned about that, but it is a somewhat mild piece of legislation with some religious freedom protections, parental rights included in it. The Labor Party, on the other hand, are very keen on expanding that piece of legislation, saying it doesn't go far enough. So their Shadow Attorney General has actually expressed full support for the recommendations of the Tasmanian Law Reform Institute, which has recommended a law that is even more extreme than Victoria's current laws. It would criminalise voluntary religious counselling, penalise parents who do not affirm the gender identity of their child or children if they are gender confused. And it would also enforce what's called an affirmation-only approach for healthcare practitioners. So there'd be no ability for doctors or psychiatrists to try and encourage a child to stay their present gender if they are gender confused. So it's a very it's a big risk for Tasmania when you consider those kinds of recommendations being endorsed by the Labor Shadow Attorney General. And then, of course, even with the milder version proposed by the Rockcliffe government, we are working hard to communicate that is not a good piece of legislation, nor is it necessary.
Okay, it might be the choice of the best of bad policies around those sorts of important issues, but I think listeners can hear where your heartbeat is going there, and there's some extremism there, and we might even say it's extreme that they might even be proposing such a things. But there's extreme and there's more extreme and there's really extreme when it comes to those issues around those important things to do with conversion therapy. You've mentioned decriminalisation of drugs. There's state funding for the Dark Mofo Festival too. Is that a big issue for Tasmanians, do you think, or is it an important one? I know that ACL's had some thoughts.
It's one that we wanted to raise this election. It's something we have spoken consistently on since the festival began, simply because it's filled with blasphemous symbols. It's quite dark, as the title would suggest. Many instances of mocking Christianity within the festival, or engaging in very dark pagan or even demonic rituals. So we very much believe as the ACL that this type of festival should not be one receiving public funding. And there is concern amongst the Christian community about that, whether or not it's able to wield much influence this election. Both major parties do support it for economic reasons. But we raise it with members and we raise it with parties because we want to be that consistent voice against it and build opposition as much as we can.
Just quickly, Ashlyn, on the protection for faith-based schools for Tassie voters, what have you gleaned and the research on your website? What is it showing about whether members are in favour of protecting faith-based schools?
So Tasmania currently has fairly limited protections for faith-based schooling. So when we look at protections, for example, to discriminate positively in hiring practices, in other words, the ability for Christian schools to require that prospective staff is actually Christian and will uphold the values of that school. In Tasmania, the situation at the moment is a hiring team is only allowed to make that a requirement if the role is specifically a religious role or related to religious practice. So there's no general exception for Christian schools existing. So we're lobbying for an expansion of those protections to enable schools to function as faith-based schools. There has been some concern about potential for even those minimal protections to be wound back. And that concern comes because there was an inquiry into what's called discrimination and bullying was the title of the inquiry. Now, obviously, bullying is not a good thing, but the terms of reference of the inquiry really focused in on these protections for Christian schooling and how they might be discriminatory. So the Liberal Party has indicated they don't intend to wind anything back. The Labor Party has not said anything to that effect. So I can't say yes or no with regards to them, but it is at least a commitment we're able to glean from the Liberals and the Nationals as well.
I'm going to ask you your thoughts on what the outcome might look like tomorrow, Ashlyn, but just to mention, great resource for voters, identifying policy differences, parties and the actual candidates. You'll see the candidates' names and what their responses have been to surveys at tasvotes.org.au. Ashlyn, we said likely hung parliament. Any thoughts about how everything might fall with the vote tomorrow?
I think the Liberals have a shot at a minority government, which is better than a hung parliament. We shall see, and that would put them back in the same position that they were before the election, which means the election was probably a waste of time. But of course, a hung parliament is indeed a possibility. I don't think the Labor Party will be getting perhaps the victory they were aiming for. But look, you never know with these things. Polls are not always 100% reliable. So, no, I certainly encourage listeners to check out our website, tasvotes.org.au, to have a bit more of a deep dive into the policies that we mentioned today. And, yeah, we'll be praying that voters can vote wisely.
And, for voters, listeners around Australia and, all the eyes of the nation come on to Tasmania when there's a state election. But it's a different sort of election in some sense. Tassie uses the proportional Hare-Clark system for its lower house elections. The 5 Tasmanian seats used at federal elections each have 7 members for a total of 35 MPs. A quota for election is 1/8 of the vote, or 12.5%. So you get a quota to win a seat. So it's a different way things work, but no doubt there'll be all sorts of television coverage around how the votes go for tomorrow's Tasmanian election. tasvotes.org.au, and especially for Tassie listeners, a real resource that you can take advantage of, and you can see what the parties are standing for. You can see what candidates are standing for. tasvotes.org.au. Ashlyn Weiss from Australian Christian Lobby, thanks so much for your great update today on 2020.
Thanks, Neil.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.